There is a particular kind of magic that happens when something completely underestimated turns out to change everything. Not a blockbuster launch with thunderous fanfare, but a quiet, stumbling beginning that somehow plants seeds deep enough to grow for decades. Star Trek, the original series, is exactly that kind of story. It debuted on September 8, 1966, on NBC, with a modest budget, an uncertain network, and a premise that many television executives found baffling. A starship, a half-alien first officer, a crew that looked like no television crew America had ever seen, and a creator who believed, perhaps more than anyone else in the room, that science fiction could be a vehicle for something genuinely important. The show ran for 3 seasons. It was never a hit by conventional standards. It was canceled, and then slowly, it became one of the most enduring cultural phenomena in the history of entertainment. The franchise it spawned has never stopped running. Its language, its imagery, and its ideas have seeped into science, technology, politics, and everyday conversation in ways that would have seemed absurd to anyone watching those early ratings reports come in. But the story behind the show, the real story, the one full of accidents and arguments and last-minute decisions and strokes of unlikely genius, is something else entirely. These are 20 weird facts about Star Trek 1966 that most people have never heard. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, did not write the show with William Shatner in his head. The original pilot, titled The Cage, was built around a different actor entirely. Jeffrey Hunter, a well-regarded Hollywood leading man whose most famous role had been portraying Jesus Christ in the 1961 epic King of Kings. Hunter brought gravity and introspection to the role of Captain Christopher Pike, and Roddenberry was satisfied with what he saw. Then Hunter left. The precise reasons remain disputed. Some accounts point to his wife, discouraging him from committing to weekly television. Others suggest Hunter himself felt the medium was beneath his ambitions at that point in his career. Whatever the cause, the departure created an opening. William Shatner walked through it, and Captain James T. Kirk was born brasher, more physical, more openly charismatic than Pike had ever been. Hunter died in 1969 at the age of 42, following complications from injuries sustained on a film set, never fully aware of what Star Trek had grown into. The alien appearance of Mr. Spock, the pointed ears, the severe brow, the faintly alien complexion, is so familiar now that it feels inevitable. But the original design concept was far more extreme. Roddenberry's early vision for the character included skin with a reddish, almost fiery hue, something meant to suggest genuine otherness, a being from somewhere genuinely different. The design sketches leaned into that unsettling quality deliberately. The problem was television technology. In 1966, a substantial portion of American households were still watching in black and white, and red-tone makeup photographed, very dark on monochrome screens. Dark enough to create associations that the production team had no interest in making. The solution was a shift toward a yellow-green tint subtle enough to read as unusual, without causing problems in black and white. Ironically, that tint was so understated that many viewers watching in color barely noticed it at all. The ears did the work instead. Of all the technologies Star Trek introduced to popular imagination, the transporter may be the most philosophically provocative. The ability to dissolve a human being into pure energy, transmit that energy across space, and reassemble the original person somewhere else raises questions about identity, consciousness, and the nature of the self that scientists and philosophers still debate. It also began as nothing more than a budget fix. The original plan for moving characters between the Enterprise and planetary surfaces involved shuttlecraft, a logical, visually coherent approach that would have required building detailed sets and filming sequences the production simply could not afford. Someone on the production team proposed an alternative, a visual effect created by filming glittering particles falling in front of a dark background and running the footage in reverse. It was cheap. It was fast. It worked. The transporter effect cost a fraction of what shuttle sequences would have demanded, and it became one of the most recognizable images in science fiction history. Television networks do not typically give shows 2 chances to make a first impression. Star Trek got exactly that. After Roddenberry submitted The Cage to NBC in 1965, the network's response was politely devastating. Too intellectual, too slow, lacking sufficient action, and pointedly difficult to accept with a woman serving as first officer. Majel Barrett played the character known only as Number One, and network executives of that era were simply not prepared to place a woman in that position of authority on a mainstream drama. NBC passed on the pilot, but, in an unusual gesture, commissioned a second one. Roddenberry rebuilt. Number One was written out. Kirk and a more energized supporting cast came in. The tone shifted toward faster pacing and more overt adventure. The second pilot sold the show. And The Cage did not go to waste. Roddenberry later reconstructed it into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which became the only episode in the original series to win a Hugo Award. Rejection became recognition. By the end of Star Trek's first season, Nichelle Nichols had grown restless. As Lieutenant Uhura, she was doing something genuinely radical for American television, occupying a position of professional authority as a black woman in a primetime drama, at a moment when such representation was nearly non-existent. But Broadway beckoned, and Nichols submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. Before he could respond, she attended a civil rights fundraiser where she was told that someone wanted to meet her. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King told her, directly and seriously, that Uhura was not simply a character on a science fiction program. She was a symbol for children, particularly black children, who saw the future depicted on that show. Uhura was proof that they belonged in it. Nichols withdrew her resignation. She later described that conversation as among the most consequential of her life. And Uhura remained on the Enterprise for the full run of the original series and beyond. The identification between Leonard Nimoy and Spock is so complete that it can be difficult to imagine a time when Nimoy was genuinely unsure he wanted any part of the role. But in the early days of production, his doubts were real. The prosthetic ears and the greenish makeup worried him, not for reasons of vanity, but because he feared the visual effect would read as monstrous rather than sympathetic, casting Spock as a villain-adjacent freak rather than a character the audience could invest in. Beyond the appearance, the emotional demands of the role presented a different kind of challenge. Nimoy was a classically trained actor whose instincts were built around expressiveness and emotional availability. Spock required the complete suppression of all visible feeling, a discipline that ran against everything his training had taught him. What changed his mind was the audience. Viewers did not see a monster. They saw something beneath the composure, restraint rather than absence, logic that coexisted with the deeply buried warmth. Nimoy's two autobiographies trace the arc of his relationship with the character. The first, published in 1975, was titled, I Am Not Spock. The second, in 1995, was titled, I Am Spock. On November 22, 1968, Star Trek broadcast what is widely cited as one of the first interracial kisses in the history of American primetime television between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. The network's anxiety about that moment produced one of the more remarkable backstage stories of the entire series. NBC insisted that the kiss be framed as involuntary. The characters were to be compelled by the telepathic manipulation of alien captors so that any affiliate station that objected could frame it as sci-fi coercion rather than a genuine expression of human connection. Shatner and Nichols were aware of this framing, and they found a way around it. During takes in which the two actors were directed to keep their faces apart, they subtly and deliberately fumbled the performances. Small errors, nothing egregious, just enough to make those takes unusable. The take in which they faced each other was the one that worked. The network got its alien mind control disclaimer. The actors got their moment. The scene aired. Letters arrived from across the country, including, Nichols later recalled, from a Southern white viewer who wrote to say that what he witnessed had caused him to reconsider beliefs he had held for his entire life. At the end of its first season, Star Trek was not a hit. NBC's cancellation discussions were not hypothetical, they were active. What happened next was something television had genuinely never seen before. Fans organized. Without the internet, without social media, without any digital tool of any kind, they coordinated letter-writing campaigns that flooded NBC's mailrooms with hundreds of thousands. Some estimates suggest over 1 million pieces of correspondence. Petitions circulated on university campuses. Fans protested outside NBC's offices. The network relented and renewed the show. then faced the same campaign again after the second season, and relented again. NBC even made a public announcement at a fan convention that the series would continue, one of the earliest recorded instances of audience pressure visibly reversing a network's cancellation decision. The third season, unfortunately, suffered from budget cuts and a late Friday nighttime slot that guaranteed poor ratings, and the show was finally canceled in 1969. But those 3 seasons, all of them, including the hard-won third, gave Star Trek enough episodes to enter syndication. That changed everything. The filming model of the USS Enterprise, 11 feet long, one of the most iconic artificial objects in the history of storytelling, was never actually completed. The sections of the hull that faced the camera were meticulously detailed, painted, and finished to the standard the production required. The underside of the model, however, was left rough, bare, and unpainted in significant sections. The rationale was entirely practical. Every camera angle was composed from above or the side. No shot required the underside to be presentable, and no budget existed to finish surfaces the audience would never see. The model is now preserved in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, which acquired it in 1974. It is displayed prominently. The unfinished underside is not visible from any standard viewing angle. This is the fact that most Star Trek fans know, but still cannot quite accept on a visceral level. "Beam me up, Scotty." The phrase on the bumper stickers, the t-shirts, the greeting cards, the phrase that astronauts aboard the International Space Station invoked when James Doohan passed away in 2005, does not appear anywhere in the original series. Not once. Kirk says, "Beam us up, Scotty." He says, "Scotty, beam me up." He says, "Enterprise, beam me up." He approaches the phrase from every direction except the exact combination of words that entered the culture. The misquote became more famous than any actual quote from the show, which is itself a remarkable thing, a demonstration that the cultural memory of a text and the text itself can diverge completely, and that the version people carry in their heads is sometimes more durable than what was originally said. Star Trek depicted a universe populated by dozens of distinct alien civilizations, each with its own visual identity. Week after week, the costume department produced outfits that looked appropriately strange and distant. A significant portion of those outfits had been made for entirely different productions years, or even decades earlier. Hollywood studio warehouses in the 1960s were vast repositories of accumulated wardrobe, everything from biblical epics and Western serials to medieval adventures and early science fiction films. Star Trek's costume team worked those archives systematically, pulling pieces and transforming them through repainting, re-accessorizing, and creative modification. A Roman toga became alien ceremonial dress. A medieval breastplate, repainted and fitted with new insignia, became the armor of a distant warrior culture. The results were often convincing enough for television, a medium where the illusion only has to hold for a moment at a time. The hand phaser, the standard sidearm of Starfleet officers, capable of setting opponents to stun or full disintegration, was built on a foundation of existing plastic novelty props and low-budget toy ray guns already sitting in the studio's inventory from previous productions. The prop department modified them, new paint, added components, reshaped details. The results had a slightly lightweight quality that close inspection revealed. The plastic was cheap, the proportions slightly off for a serious weapon, but with correct lighting and the right sound design, they read as futuristic. The phaser went on to inspire serious research. The United States military has invested substantial resources over subsequent decades in directed energy weapons, laser-based and particle beam systems that are conceptually descended from what Star Trek's prop team assembled out of toy parts in the mid-1960s. The Trouble with Tribbles, the 1967 episode in which the Enterprise is overrun by small, warm, purring, endlessly reproducing fuzzy creatures, is among the most beloved hours in the show's entire run. Witty, well-constructed, and genuinely funny, it demonstrated that Star Trek could succeed at comedy as well as drama. Behind the scenes, it was a minor operational catastrophe. The Tribble props were made from synthetic fur stretched over foam cores, with small vibrating motors embedded in some of them to simulate the purring effect. Under the intense heat of the studio lighting, the synthetic fur became a generator of static electricity. Tribbles adhered to actors' uniforms. They attached to set furniture. They clung to camera equipment. Crew members received small but persistent shocks whenever they handled them. Hundreds of tribble props were required for the episode's climactic scenes, and each one was its own static hazard. The production team developed protocols for discharging the props between takes and limiting their exposure to the lights. The red shirt, shorthand in storytelling and popular culture for a disposable character inserted into a dangerous situation to demonstrate stakes without risking characters the audience cares about, gets its name directly from Star Trek's uniform color code. Engineering and security personnel wore red, and the anonymous crew members in those departments who joined away missions had a notably high mortality rate. Nobody on the production team announced this pattern. No writer's room memo said, "Let's make red shirts the sacrificial color." It accumulated organically, episode by episode, until audiences had absorbed the visual grammar unconsciously. The show never acknowledged it explicitly, but the pattern was real enough to be documented by fans who later compiled statistics on-screen deaths by uniform color. The term now appears in academic discussions of narrative structure and in corporate culture as a reference to employees assigned to high-risk tasks without adequate protection or consideration. Ask almost anyone to name Star Trek's signature antagonists, and they will say the Klingon. The warrior race with the ridged foreheads and the code of honor is so central to the franchise's identity that imagining it without them seems impossible. In the original series, though, the Klingon were secondary. The Romulans appeared first, introduced in the first season episode Balance of Terror, which remains one of the most critically admired hours in the show's history, and were positioned as the primary antagonist civilization. Secretive, disciplined, and philosophically complex, the Romulans functioned as a Cold War allegory with genuine texture. The Klingon arrived later in the first season and dominated the second, but their role in the original series was never as central as later films and series made it seem. It was Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, and Star Trek, The Next Generation that elevated the Klingon to their current status. The original show had a more varied sense of who the enemy was. Captain Kirk's signature quality, the willingness to trust human instinct over data, to override the computer's calculation and find a third option the machine hadn't considered, was not simply a character trait. It was a conscious narrative argument embedded into the show by Roddenberry and his writing staff. The ship's computer was written to speak in probabilities, mission failure rates, projected casualty figures, statistical impossibilities. And Kirk consistently, decisively, overrode it. Every time. And was right. This was the show making a specific claim about the relationship between human judgment and machine intelligence at the precise moment that computers were entering public consciousness for the first time. The argument the show was staging in 1966 about whether algorithmic calculation should be trusted to make decisions with moral weight is indistinguishable from arguments being had right now about artificial intelligence and automated decision-making. Gene Roddenberry had ambitions for Star Trek that went well beyond science fiction entertainment. He wanted to use the future as a lens through which to examine the present, to hold a mirror up to American society in the late 1960s and show it something about itself it might not otherwise be willing to look at. The problem was that network censors in 1966 were vigilant about anything that touched directly on civil rights, Vietnam, political corruption, or social inequality. Roddenberry and his writers found a solution, Allegory. Put your argument in alien skin and set it on a distant world in a future century. And the censors found it harder to object. The episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, features two humanoid aliens locked in centuries of mutual hatred over which side of their faces is which color. An allegory so direct it barely qualifies as one. Other episodes tackled war, profiteering, mob rule, and religious fanaticism through the same mechanism. It was political theater, wearing a space opera costume, and it reached audiences who might have rejected the same ideas delivered without the science fiction wrapper. At some point during production, someone decided that what the world needed was a holiday music album featuring the cast of Star Trek. This happened. It was as gloriously strange as it sounds. William Shatner brought his signature theatrical intensity to festive material with results that defied easy categorization: earnest, odd, and somehow completely committed. Leonard Nimoy, staying true to the introspective, qual-spoken word material.